My name is Claire Thompson. I'm in my mid-30s now, and for most of my life, I've been described with words like easy, reliable, and low maintenance. The kind of person people trust to handle things quietly, the kind they don't worry about checking on too closely. I live alone, I work a steady job, I don't raise my voice, and I don't share much unless I'm asked. If you met me briefly, you might assume I've lived a fairly uncomplicated life. Nothing dramatic, nothing worth a story this long. That assumption is part of why this happened the way it did. This isn't a story about revenge. It's not about exposing anyone or humiliating them or winning some imaginary argument years too late. It's a story about what happens when accountability is replaced by gaslighting and how quiet people respond when they finally realize the rules were never going to be fair. Several years ago, my parents took my savings to help the family. That's the phrase that was used. It sounded temporary, responsible, almost noble. What followed wasn't a financial dispute, it was a psychological one. Because when I later asked questions, when I tried to clarify what had happened, they denied it ever occurred. Not partially, not different from how I remembered. They denied it completely. This story follows the emotional arc of that realization. Not the moment itself, but everything that came after. The subtle shifts, the recalculations, the way silence stopped being something I defaulted to and became something I chose. You won't hear shouting here. There are no explosive confrontations or dramatic ultimatums. What you'll hear instead is the slow understanding of how roles are assigned inside families, how some people are valued for their usefulness rather than their presence, and how easily truth can be rewritten when the person holding it is expected not to fight back. I'm telling this now because time has done its work. Enough distance has passed that I can speak clearly without needing to defend my emotions or exaggerate them. I'm not asking you to take sides. I'm not even asking you to agree with every decision I made. I'm only asking you to listen to how it felt from the inside, to be dismissed so calmly that it almost sounded reasonable. This is a story about restraint, about documentation, about the quiet kind of dominance that doesn't announce itself, but still changes the outcome permanently. And maybe, as you listen, you'll recognize something familiar. Not in the details, but in the pattern, because many of us have been underestimated by the people who knew us longest. Have you ever realized, much later, that the moment you were most hurt was also the moment you stopped being seen? For most of my life, I was the easy one. That's how my parents described me to relatives. That's how decisions were made around me. If there was something uncomfortable to discuss, something that required patience or something no one else wanted to handle, it naturally fell to me, because I wouldn't make it harder. I didn't push back. I didn't dramatize. I adapted. Growing up, I learned quickly that being low friction made life smoother for everyone else. My siblings were louder, more reactive. They argued, negotiated, and demanded explanations. I watched all of that and decided, quietly, that I didn't want to be a problem anyone had to solve. So I became reliable. I paid attention. I remembered dates. I helped without being asked. I listened more than I spoke, and when I did speak, I chose my words carefully. Adults praised that. Teachers loved it. My parents leaned on it. What no one ever said out loud, but everyone behaved as if it were true, was that my calm made me expandable. If I was disappointed, it was assumed I'd get over it. If something felt unfair, it was assumed I understood why. If I was left out of a decision, it was assumed I trusted their judgment. I didn't throw tantrums, so there was no urgency to explain things to me. I didn't demand reassurance, so it wasn't offered. Over time, that created a very specific version of me in their minds. Someone who didn't need much, and therefore couldn't lose much. By the time I was an adult, that version had solidified. I was the daughter who would be fine, the one who didn't need protecting, the one whose life was steady enough to absorb small shocks without complaint. When I moved out, got a stable job, and lived within my means, it only reinforced that image. They saw independence. They didn't see caution. They saw maturity. They didn't see how closely I tracked everything: money, conversations, promises. What they especially didn't see was that my quiet wasn't emptiness. It was containment. When family conversations happened, I often sat slightly outside the center of them. Not excluded exactly, just not essential. Plans would be discussed that involved my time or resources as if my consent were a given. Claire won't mind. Claire understands. Claire's good with that. And I was, until I wasn't. But even that line, until I wasn't, came much later. At the time, I still believed that being seen as dependable was a form of respect. I believed that being underestimated was safer than being scrutinized. I believed that if something mattered enough, someone would ask me directly. That belief shaped how I behaved when the request about money came. It's important to understand that, because from the outside, it might look like a single decision, one transfer, one conversation. From the inside, it was the natural conclusion of years of conditioning. I was the one who saved quietly, who didn't talk about it, who didn't announce milestones. I had learned early that sharing too much invited opinions, and opinions invited control. So my savings were invisible by design. Invisible things are easy to reperceive. When my parents framed it as helping the family, it didn't sound like theft. It sounded like responsibility finally being acknowledged, like trust, like my steadiness had been noticed after all. What I didn't realize yet was that they weren't seeing me. They were seeing a role that didn't include questioning, memory, or consequences. To them, I wasn't someone who would later say, "That hurt me." I was someone who would quietly absorb it and move on. That was who I was to them. And for a long time, I played that part so well that even I forgot there was another option. The first time it happened, it didn't register as betrayal. That's important to say, because people often imagine moments like these as sharp and obvious. Raised voices, clear boundaries crossed, a before and after you can point to. This wasn't like that. This was small, polite, almost reasonable. It came wrapped in reassurance. My parents didn't sit me down formally. There was no heavy pause before the conversation. It happened in the kitchen, casually, while something was simmering on the stove. My mother mentioned that things were a little tight right now. My father followed with a comment about how families sometimes need to support each other. They didn't ask directly at first. They talked around it. They mentioned unexpected expenses, someone else's mistake, a short-term gap. They spoke as if the solution already existed and was simply waiting to be acknowledged. I remember nodding along, listening carefully, doing mental math, not because I felt pressured, but because this was familiar territory. I was good at filling gaps. When the request finally came, it was framed carefully. They didn't say loan, they didn't say take, they said help. Just for now, just until things settled, just until the family was steady again. And then came the line that made it feel safe. We know you're responsible. That word, responsible, landed softly. It always had. I didn't say yes immediately. I asked a few clarifying questions. How much? For how long? What the plan was? The answers were vague, but delivered with confidence. And underneath all of it was the unspoken assurance that this wasn't something I'd later need to defend, that this was understood, mutual. I remember thinking, they wouldn't forget this. I remember thinking, they wouldn't deny it. I remember thinking, this is what trust looks like. The transfer itself was quiet. No paperwork, no written agreement, just a confirmation number and a mental note. I didn't announce it to anyone else. I didn't even mark it dramatically in my records. At the time, it felt temporary enough not to deserve a ceremony. What surprised me wasn't what happened next, but what didn't. There was no follow-up, no acknowledgement beyond a brief thank you, no check-in. Weeks passed, then months. If I hinted at it indirectly, the response was light. Things are still complicated. You know how it is. Always vague, always reasonable. And then one day, I brought it up plainly. Not emotionally, not accusingly, just a simple question about timing, about when things might be settled enough to talk about returning the money. The shift was subtle, but immediate. My mother looked confused, not thoughtfully confused, but disrupted, as if I'd referenced a detail that didn't belong in the scene. My father frowned slightly and said, "What are you talking about?" At first, I thought he meant the specifics, the amount, the timeline, so I clarified. And that's when he said it. That never happened. It wasn't said defensively. It wasn't said angrily. It was said with certainty, calm, almost dismissive, as if I'd mixed up a memory or misunderstood a conversation. I laughed reflexively, not because it was funny, but because it felt unreal. I assumed this was a misunderstanding that would resolve itself once I explained, but it didn't. Instead, the explanation shifted again. Maybe I'd offer. Maybe it was a gift. Maybe I was remembering wrong. Each version gently moved the responsibility away from them and placed it somewhere hazy, somewhere that didn't require correction. No one else in the family reacted. No one stepped in. No one said, "Wait, that's not how I remember it." And that was the first small cut, not the money, the denial. The moment I realized that my memory could be erased simply by being inconvenient, and that no one felt the need to protect it. I didn't confront them then. I didn't escalate. I told myself it was confusion, stress, miscommunication, but something had shifted. Not loudly, just enough to be noticed. After that first denial, I didn't walk away. I adjusted. That's what I'd always done. Made internal corrections so the external world didn't have to change. I told myself the moment had been mishandled, that stress had blurred things, that if I stayed calm, clarity would return on its own. It felt mature to give it time, so I did what quiet people often do when something feels wrong but not yet dangerous. I minimized it. I reframed the denial as confusion. I reminded myself that families are complicated, that money conversations can be messy, and that intent matters more than precision. I stopped bringing it up directly, but the pattern didn't stop. It spread. Small comments started to land differently. If I referenced something from the past, I'd hear, "That's not how I remember it." If I mentioned a prior agreement, it became, "You're reading too much into that." Nothing aggressive, nothing overt, just gentle rewrites of reality delivered with enough confidence to make hesitation feel irrational. At first, I met those moments with explanation, then with silence. Silence was easier. Silence didn't risk conflict. Silence kept the peace intact, and I had spent most of my life believing that peace, any peace, was worth protecting. What I didn't realize was that each unchallenged dismissal made the next one easier. It wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about how my version of events carried less weight by default, how my recollections required verification, while theirs were accepted without question. How often the phrase, "you're sensitive," appeared, as if perception itself were a flaw. I started to notice how decisions were discussed around me instead of with me, how assumptions were made about my availability, my patience, my forgiveness. It wasn't malicious. That almost made it worse. It was habitual. And habits don't apologize. There was a particular moment, small, almost forgettable, that crystallized this for me. A family conversation where a past incident came up casually. I corrected a detail gently. Just a date, just a fact. My mother waved it off and said, "You always remember things differently." The room moved on. No one asked what I meant. No one paused to consider the correction. The dismissal was seamless, practiced. I remember sitting there, realizing something with a strange sense of calm. This isn't temporary. This isn't about stress or confusion or time. This is the role I've been placed in, the one whose memory is flexible, whose boundaries are negotiable, whose contributions are invisible once absorbed. And still, I didn't confront them. Part of me believed that if I stayed reasonable long enough, reason would be rewarded. That if I remained calm, the truth would eventually reassert itself. That accountability would appear on its own, like balance restored after a disturbance. Another part of me, quieter but growing, was already observing. Not reacting, just noting. I started remembering conversations more clearly. Not emotionally, structurally, who said what, how things were framed, which words were used when responsibility needed to disappear. I didn't announce this change. I barely acknowledged it to myself. From the outside, nothing about me seemed different. I was still helpful, still composed, still the easiest person in the room. Inside, something had shifted from trust to awareness. I stopped expecting validation. I stopped assuming shared memory. I stopped believing that being good would be enough to be treated fairly. That's how disrespect becomes normalized. Not through cruelty, but through repetition without consequence. Through silence that looks like consent. Through roles that harden while no one is watching. By the time I realized how far it had gone, the question was no longer, why are they doing this? It was, why am I still allowing it? And that question didn't demand an immediate answer. It just waited. The clearest realization didn't come during an argument. It came during a moment of efficiency. A family issue came up. Logistical, inconvenient, emotionally charged. Plans needed adjusting. Someone had to step in, reorganize, smooth things over. Before I was even fully aware of the conversation turning, all eyes shifted toward me. Not with urgency, with relief. No one asked if I could handle it. No one checked whether it disrupted my life. It was simply understood that I would take care of it, because that's what I did. That's what I had always done. And in that moment, I saw the role clearly. I wasn't the decision maker. I wasn't the one who needed to be persuaded. I was the stabilizer. The person who absorbed fallout, who filled the gaps, who kept things running quietly in the background while others remained central, visible, and emotionally protected. I realized then that my earlier confusion about the money, about the denial, about the shifting narratives, wasn't because the situation was unclear. It was because I had misidentified my position within it. I wasn't being treated unfairly by accident. I was being treated according to my role. In that role, my resources were communal, but my needs were individual. My memory was optional. My discomfort was negotiable. My silence was assumed. It explained why accountability felt unnecessary to them. Why did denying my experience not trigger guilt? Why the idea that I might withdraw or even remember differently seemed almost absurd. The role depended on my consistency, on my predictability, on my reluctance to disrupt, and I had reinforced it for years. This wasn't a realization that made me angry. It made me precise. Because once you see the role, you see its boundaries. You see what's expected of you and what will never be offered in return. I understood then that explaining myself wouldn't change anything. Neither would proving my memory nor revisiting old conversations. The system wasn't broken. It was functioning exactly as designed. What unsettled me most was how calm I felt about this discovery. No surge of emotion, no urge to confront, just clarity. I began to test the role gently, not by refusing outright, but by pausing, by asking for details instead of filling in gaps automatically, by delaying responses, by letting small inconveniences remain unresolved unless someone explicitly addresses them. The reactions were immediate but subtle. Confusion, mild irritation, comments about how things were easier before. No one asked what had changed. That told me everything. I wasn't valued for my presence, I was valued for my function. And as long as I performed it, no one needed to reflect on how they treated me. That was the moment I stopped waiting for fairness. Not because I no longer believed in it, but because I understood where it wouldn't come from. I didn't announce this shift. I didn't demand renegotiation. I simply began to withdraw internally while remaining outwardly the same, calm, polite, involved enough not to raise suspicion. What they didn't realize was that roles rely on unspoken agreements, and unspoken agreements can be dissolved quietly, without confrontation, without explanation. I had been assigned invisibility because I had mistaken peace for respect. That mistake wouldn't be repeated. The day something shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no revelation, no dramatic line spoken aloud that would later replay in my head. It was an ordinary afternoon, quiet enough that it almost disappeared into the rest of that year. I was sitting alone at my kitchen table, going through old bank records, not with any particular intention, just routine maintenance. I developed the habit of reviewing things periodically, not out of anxiety, but out of order. Numbers made sense. They didn't reinterpret themselves. When I reached the month of the transfer, I paused. Not because I'd forgotten it, but because seeing it again, time-stamped, precise, created a contrast that felt almost physical. There it was, the amount, the date, the confirmation. Undeniable. And suddenly, the weight of what had happened landed differently. It wasn't just that my parents had taken my savings and denied it. It was that they had done so knowing I wouldn't erupt, knowing I wouldn't humiliate them, knowing I'd try to resolve it privately, calmly, reasonably. They hadn't misjudged me. They'd counted on me. That realization didn't hurt the way betrayal usually does. It steadied me, like a door closing somewhere behind my ribcage. I felt something settle into place, a boundary I hadn't consciously drawn before. I stopped asking why. Instead, I asked a more useful question. What does this tell me about how they see consequences? The answer was simple. They didn't see any. Not from me. And that's when the shift happened. Not outwardly, not in my behavior, but in my orientation. I stopped thinking in terms of repair. Up until that point, every internal calculation I'd made assumed reconciliation as the goal. Clarity, mutual understanding, a return to something resembling fairness. I had been moving within the emotional framework of someone who expected accountability to eventually surface. That expectation dissolved quietly. In its place came something calmer, acceptance. Not forgiveness, not resignation. Acceptance of the system I was operating in. Once I accepted that denial was a strategy, not a misunderstanding, I could stop trying to counter it with explanation. Once I accepted that my role depended on my silence, I could decide when silence served me instead. I remember closing my laptop and sitting still for a long time. No racing thoughts, no urge to call anyone. Just a sense of internal alignment I hadn't felt before. I didn't need to confront them. I didn't need to warn them. I didn't need to prove anything. I needed to reposition myself. From that day on, I treated information differently. I stopped offering it freely. I stopped narrating my thoughts. I stopped assuming that transparency would be met with good faith. I became selective. Conversations that once would have included context became shorter. Answers became accurate, but incomplete. I didn't lie. I just stopped volunteering. This wasn't punishment, it was protection. And it was invisible. If anyone noticed the change, they didn't name it, because naming it would require acknowledging that something had shifted, and that acknowledgement would lead uncomfortably close to responsibility. So life continued as before. But I didn't. That afternoon marked the end of something I'd carried quietly for years. The belief that if I stayed calm long enough, truth would defend itself. Truth doesn't defend itself. People do. And from that day on, I chose myself. Without announcement, without drama, without asking permission. Before that shift, my silence had been instinctive. I stayed quiet because it felt safer, because it kept things smooth, because I believed that not reacting was a form of maturity. I told myself I was choosing peace, even when peace came at my expense. After that day, silence became deliberate. The difference was subtle but profound. I wasn't withdrawing emotionally or sulking. I was observing, measuring, deciding what deserved my energy and what didn't. When conversations drifted toward assumptions about my time or resources, I didn't immediately fill the gap. I let the silence sit. I watched how quickly others rushed to cover it, who became uncomfortable, who tried to redirect. I learned a lot in those pauses. People are remarkably honest when they think you're still predictable. They continued to speak around me as if my agreement were implicit. They continued to make light comments about how easy I was. They continued to rely on my calm as if it were permanent infrastructure, something that didn't require maintenance. And because I wasn't reacting, they assumed nothing had changed. That was the advantage of being underestimated. I began to understand that silence can be read in two ways, as weakness or as control. Which one people choose depends on how invested they are in your compliance. They chose weakness. That misinterpretation gave me room. I started documenting things, not obsessively, not emotionally, just factually. Dates, amounts, statements made casually and then forgotten. I didn't store this information with the intent to confront. I stored it because clarity is a form of leverage, even if you never use it. Outwardly, I remained polite, available enough, present at family events. I didn't create distance that could be questioned. I didn't challenge narratives in real time. Inside, I was no longer participating in them. It surprised me how quickly the dynamic adapted, without me having to announce anything. When I didn't immediately agree, someone else stepped in. When I didn't volunteer, plans were made differently. Not better, just differently. And no one thanked me for all the times before. That absence of acknowledgement confirmed what I already knew. My silence had always been interpreted as consent, not generosity. Now that silence belonged to me. There was a moment, small, almost invisible, when my mother made an offhand remark about my finances. Something assumptive. Something she wouldn't have said if she believed I might correct her. I didn't. I let it pass. Not because I agreed, but because I was no longer interested in adjusting their perception of me. Their assumptions were becoming useful. They revealed exactly how far they believed they could go. The more they underestimated me, the clearer my path became. This wasn't about strategy in a dramatic sense. There were no secret plans unfolding behind the scenes. It was about orientation, about no longer positioning myself as the emotional buffer between their behavior and its consequences. I stopped cushioning outcomes. If something was inconvenient, I let it be inconvenient. If something was unclear, I didn't rush to clarify it for everyone else. I allowed discomfort to exist without immediately neutralizing it. And still, no one asked me what was wrong, because the version of me they believed in didn't have a wrong. She absorbed, she adapted, she moved on. They didn't notice that I was still calm, but no longer accommodating. That was the miscalculation. Because silence, once chosen, is not emptiness. It's direction. What they never noticed was how much I was learning. Not in an obvious way. I didn't suddenly become distant or cold. I didn't start asking pointed questions or correcting people mid-sentence. I stayed consistent enough to remain unremarkable. That consistency was intentional. Because when people believe you're unchanged, they stop filtering themselves. They speak freely, they reveal patterns, they repeat behaviors without checking whether they're being observed. I noticed everything. I noticed how often stories shifted depending on the audience, how details blurred when responsibility was inconvenient, but sharpened when praise was involved. I noticed how quickly my parents dismissed discomfort that wasn't theirs, and how carefully they managed their own. Most of all, I noticed how often they relied on time to do the work of erasure. If enough time passed, they assumed events would lose their shape. Those memories would soften. That certainty would become negotiable. And with me, that strategy had always worked, because I had never challenged it before. They didn't know I'd stopped forgetting. I began to organize my records, not just financial ones, but conversational patterns. I wrote down phrases that came up repeatedly. Deflections, minimizations, the subtle language used to make denial sound reasonable. You're misunderstanding. That's not what was meant. You're remembering it wrong. These weren't emotional reactions. They were tools, and tools are predictable. The more I documented, the calmer I became. Not because I was planning something dramatic, but because ambiguity was dissolving. There's a particular peace that comes from knowing you're not imagining things. Outwardly, my life stayed simple. Work, home, family gatherings. I didn't escalate, I didn't confront, I didn't hint at future consequences. That's why no one noticed when I started making structural changes. I separated my finances completely. Not just practically, but psychologically. I stopped treating my resources as shared by default. I updated beneficiaries. I reviewed documents I'd ignored before because they seemed unnecessary for someone like me. I learned the language of boundaries. Not the emotional kind, but the administrative kind. The kind that doesn't require explanations or debates. The kind that exists on paper. None of this felt vengeful. It felt adult. I was no longer responding to a hurt. I was responding to information. And the information was clear. People who deny reality don't change when confronted. They change when access is removed. They still saw me as compliant, still assumed my silence meant understanding, still believed that if anything truly bothered me, I'd say so. They mistook my restraint for passivity. What they didn't see was that I had stopped waiting for them to do the right thing. I had accepted that they wouldn't. That acceptance freed me from the need to convince, explain, or defend. I didn't need them to agree with my version of events. I only needed to ensure that my future no longer depended on their honesty. There's a strange power in being underestimated. It creates space. It lowers defenses. It allows preparation to happen in plain sight. While they continued rewriting the past, I was securing the future, and I didn't need to announce any of it, because the most effective changes are the ones that don't ask for permission and don't require recognition to work. The reveal didn't happen in a room full of people. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no moment where someone finally admitted the truth. The clarity I gained was entirely private, and because of that, it was complete. It came while I was reviewing documents I never thought I'd need to look at so closely. Old emails, archived bank statements, records that had existed the entire time, quietly waiting for attention. I wasn't searching for vindication. I already knew what had happened. I was looking for alignment, and that's when I saw it clearly. Not just the transfer, but the pattern surrounding it. The timing, the language used in follow-up messages, the careful absence of written acknowledgement after the money changed hands. It wasn't accidental. They had avoided anything that created permanence. No text confirming repayment, no email outlining terms, no message that couldn't later be reframed as something else. That wasn't confusion. That was design. The realization didn't make my chest tighten or my stomach drop. It did the opposite. It simplified everything. I understood then that I had been dealing with people who relied on ambiguity as insulation, who believed that if nothing was recorded, nothing could be proven, and if nothing could be proven, nothing had to be accounted for. They weren't reckless. They were careful, and that told me exactly how to proceed. I didn't feel the urge to expose them. I didn't feel triumphant. There was no sense of victory, just a quiet recalibration of expectations. I had been operating under the assumption that shared history carried weight, that familial bonds created a baseline of honesty. That assumption was wrong, so I replaced it with something sturdier. I began treating every interaction as informational, not emotionally charged, just data. I noticed when they contradicted themselves, when timelines shifted, when phrasing softened around uncomfortable facts. I didn't correct them. I let the inconsistencies exist, because inconsistency only becomes dangerous when someone else is required to maintain it, and I had stopped doing that work for them. The most important part of this reveal wasn't about leverage in a dramatic sense. It was about the clarity of the terrain. I knew now that if accountability ever appeared, it would be accidental, not chosen. I knew that confronting them with proof would lead to deflection.